All right, we're back for another episode, and Elliot and I have been having quite a few conversations just with clients about their investments and just maybe seeding some expectations for the upcoming fall. I know it's going to be a hot topic by the time this episode airs, but yeah, we want to talk about investments in election cycles since we're so fortunate to be subjected to all the political ads that are probably going to start hitting here in the next couple of weeks. So, Elliot, why don't you lead us off? Why don't we start with more of a present focus and like, how are you talking to your clients about this? Like, are you educating them on this as you start working with them? Now we're coming up on an election cycle. I guess how are you handling that with your clients right now?
Yeah, I mean, I would like it if we could just skip to past November and never have this conversation personally. But I did send something out earlier this year to my newsletter, and I sent it purposefully early before we got to the political ads, before I think it was even narrowed down to whoever was going to be the primary for each party. Basically saying that at least from an historical stock market perspective, it doesn't really matter who gets elected in terms of your party. And we have certain people who certainly want one party to get elected over the other. And, there's good policy discussion around that and economic consequences. And, we could go into all that. But really, from a stock market perspective and investing, if you look back, whether it's Republican or Democrat, just setting those expectations for folks, the market doesn't really care who is elected. You look under both parties, one might be slightly better than the other. For all intents and purposes, though, it's about the same. So just having those conversations earlier in the year, I frankly haven't had a ton right now. I'm sure we'll, as we get closer to the election cycle, and I do dread this, just because I think it is going to be a very heated and emotional topic, that's going to come up. So that's how I'm approaching it. How are you handling that right now?
Yeah, I love that. It's actually funny. I feel like I've been talking more to my clients about some of the tax changes that could
Mm-hmm.
come. I feel like I mean, taxes certainly top of mind as we record this. And I think that more people pay more attention to their tax return on average than their investment accounts, at least my clients anyways, where
Yeah.
they've kind of hired that away, right? So they're paying me to do that for them. But everyone sees their tax return and they feel that. But to go back to it, I'm certainly going to save this chart that I'll bring up here in a few minutes for my newsletter, probably the month before the election, just to remind everyone, like, don't panic. But my biggest question when some of those politically charged statements come up, like, oh, if so and so gets elected, like the economy is going to go to hell in a handbasket, and taxes are going to go up, and it's just not going to be good for jobs and all this stuff, and that's going to impact the economy. I'm to a degree, some of that is true, right? Like each party has their agenda, but that doesn't mean that it's going to show up in all of your investments in the same way, right? And so, while a lot of the companies that you can publicly invest in through the stock market are certainly bigger than, our small businesses or even the small businesses here in the Madison region, like sometimes certain parties are more favorable to the small business versus like the giant corporation. And there's ways that you can invest and make sure that you're not all being subject to what they decide on corporate tax rates to be, for example, right? And so um yeah, it's just an interesting conversation. But that's a question I'd like to ask, like, okay, client, I hear you, like that's a fair and valid argument, but can you tell me where that's going to show up in your investments, and how we can best avoid that worst case scenario that you're outlining? And they usually don't have a great answer, which I don't think there is one, so it's not to blame them. But the second question I'd like to ask, if those types of questions do come up, is okay, if we're going to get out of the market, when do we get back in, right? And that's where I think we talked about this in the last episode, but getting out of the market entirely can be super risky for its own reasons. And we saw a lot of this during COVID. I think even back in 2016, right, when I think that was my first election as a working advisor. But there were some massive fluctuations in the 24 hours past and leading up to the election. And those short term swings can really erode a lot of work that you've done over your life. So I don't know. Any thoughts on those topics or anything there?
I was thinking of something as you were talking. It's maybe a little off topic here, but somewhat related. And that I think it's important to remember as candidates start talking about ideas. Oftentimes, you get the ends of the extremes there, sort of the outlandish things. And sometimes people grasp onto that of like, oh, what happens if they do XYZ to tax rates, or this affects small businesses in this way? And that's important to keep in mind because it's rarely does policy get actually passed on the
Mhm.
extremes. And media loves to catch on to those news articles. You'll get it out there, right? What does XYZ? You make up the thing. I mean, we've seen it where all parties there have controlled everything, and they still can't get legislation passed that's central, let alone somewhere out to the extreme. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we go out there, as you were talking about, like good for small businesses, bad for small businesses. The world's so interconnected. No one knows how this is going to flow through, but even if they could do exactly what they want or they say
Right.
they want to do.
Right. And I think this ties in really well to, some of those slides you brought up in the last episode of, what is the range of outcomes that could happen? And, like you said with policy, like, well, there is a lot that could happen, but when we take maybe one or two steps back and ask ourselves, like, is that realistic for that to actually happen? I think a lot of times the answer is no. I mean, we saw that
Yeah.
certainly with even the student loan forgiveness and, how many people were banking on that, or, oh, it's a sure thing, like the day it gets announced, and it drug on for what, 2 years, ultimately just to fall flat for most people. And now you have those student loan payments again, right? And so I think that is a really good point to make, where yes, like much like the weather, right? Like they like to pick the worst models and the worst case scenarios and advertise those or get people bought into those. And I think that's what their agenda is, right? Eyeballs on the screens and clicks on links. So yeah, be careful when you're poking around out there. It's good to do your research on candidates, but I think it's reckless to let some of those bigger ticket
Yeah.
agenda or campaign slogans maybe lead you for your long-term financial future. And to kind of put a bow on all of that piece of it too, like what happens in the next 4 years could very much be undone if it does actually get passed, in a short 4 years or at most 8 years, I suppose, if there's a successful second, election campaign. But yeah, I mean, that's what we're seeing now, right? A lot of these Trump laws that came into place with, especially with like the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, like they could go away, and that could have some really big implications on people who have set up their finances to run well in that system.
Yeah. I mean, and it's not even could go away unless people get together and agree. Like, it is going away for the most part. I think that's important as people keep in mind that the default trajectory, assuming nothing, is those go that most of that legislation goes away.
Yeah, something has to happen to keep it, right? So it's just like those opt-ins, right? Like
Yeah.
we have to opt out of that situation. So that's a good point. But I, just for the sake of not giving financial advice, Elliot, I wanted to say could.
Yep. I hear you.
Rita will appreciate that. But yeah, so I guess I'll just share this. I'll share this slide here.
Yeah, and as Matt's bringing that up, I don't want to sound cavalier or laissez-faire about all this. I mean, obviously, whoever is elected, there is impact to things, but I think it's important to keep in mind we're isolating this to stock market returns. And Matt, I think that's a perfect segue for you here.
Yeah, and so this is really showing, the trajectory of the S&P 500 over, I mean, nearly 100-year period, throughout several, different administrations, and split between, of course, both of the major parties out there. But I think what's interesting when you look at this is, first off, let's just take a real big step back, and this ties in very well to what we talked about last episode with long-term investing. But let's just pay attention to the overall trajectory, right? The up and to the right, or growth over long periods of time. But that's not to say that there aren't those scary moments that happen in between. Some of those, were timed decently well around election periods, which I don't know how much that had to do with the specific events going on in those periods of time, especially like when you look at Bush to Obama, right? A lot of maybe over hype in certain markets during that 07-08 period there where, Obama kind of came into a tough spot. Yeah, I guess, Elliot, are there any areas that jump out to you on here that you'd want to highlight?
I mean, for those listening, we're looking at a color coded chart
Oh,
here of
yeah, sorry.
Republicans in red and Democrats in blue. And so you see a pretty stable-ish pattern of rotating, like Republican, Democrat, Republican, Democrat, more or less throughout that. And as you said, it's mostly up. And just to reiterate, if you zoom out and you're looking at this over a long period, I mean, we were talking about this before the call. If you look at 2008 or 2009, it hardly looks like a dip on this map, but obviously that was a terrifying time
Yeah.
period. Uh, so when you zoom out on things, it can feel a little bit better.
Yeah, and I think the really fascinating one is like way back in the 30s. Like, I mean, there's really only been one that was catastrophically negative, right? And there were a lot of things going on back at that time period that I mean, really haven't experienced since then, you know?
And very few people were investing then, right? At the
Right,
same
right,
time. So,
right.
yeah, I love this chart. And that's that. I think I put something similar in my newsletter earlier this year just to show that, I mean, for the most part, the market is going to continue to function unless something causes it not to function. Businesses are going to earn money and we're going to see growth probably. And so you get corresponding stock market returns for that. And I think
Yeah.
that's important to sort of separate from what goes on politically.
Yeah, and I think too, like I'm glad you brought that up, Elliot, because I didn't even think of that until you just said it. But, just because we have a leadership change in the White House, right? When you look at the growth of these specific 500 companies, right? 500 large US companies, just because we have a new president doesn't mean that all of these companies are just going to have like a completely new philosophy or new leadership installed. And like you said, Elliot, like their job and the board's job to shareholders, right, is to make companies profitable. So it's very much going to be short term in most cases, drawbacks if there are huge swings in like how a company needs to operate or tax code or any of that. But those CEOs and boards, their job is to literally make the company profitable, and that's what they're being paid millions and millions and millions of dollars to do. So I think that's another really important thing is, the actual investments that you hold, right? The leadership or the makeup of those companies isn't changing overnight.
Definitely. And the last thing I may say on some of this is, and you talked about this earlier, but I just want to draw out here as we get to the end of it is there will, I won't say they're likely. Well, there might be volatility around election day. Historically, that has been the case. It is usually elevated. And that's a normal thing. But again, we're not investing for a day period or a week period. Most people are investing for years or decades, like we talked about in the past. So as much as you can ignore the noise around election day, at least as it relates to the portfolio, obviously there's some other good reasons to be
Yeah.
concerned or happy, whatever, whichever way you're voting. But as it pertains to the stock market, you might see some volatility, and that's a normal part of investing. I just want to normalize that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's a good point too. And I mean, we don't need to go into the overly technical side of it, but, just to kind of summarize the thesis behind that of what you said is, a lot of these security or stock prices, they're based on future expectations, right? And so you don't buy a company for $1 today hoping it's going to be worth $1 tomorrow, right? You want it to go up into the right, just like we saw in that chart. But, the greater the difference between the narrative leading up to the election and the actual outcome will likely increase that volatility, right? So the less that reality lines up with those expectations or those future valuations or expectations for these companies, it's more likely that you're going to see higher degrees of volatility in that. And that's exactly what happened in 2016, right?
Yeah.
The whole narrative leading up to the election was there's no way, you know, Trump wins, and then you wake up and Trump won, and it's like, oh my gosh, like what happened? And that was a really interesting day at the start of my career, where it's just like, wow, that was a huge swing, like just in the course of a day. Where, I mean, had you just bought or sold the day before the election and bought after, you might have been out 10% or something crazy like that. I can't remember what the exact numbers were, but it's a really good point, Elliot. And I think that's really what people should hold on to is you're not, unless you're trying to go from, one to a million in a year, I don't think you need to worry too much about what happens. And we don't think that's the right way to approach it.
Yeah. Well said about expectations and then reality there. I like the way you framed that.
Yeah. Yeah. Anything else you'd want to add? Just words of wisdom or a client story or two. I've certainly had clients who got out and never got back in, but I feel like we can say that time and time again. So
Yeah. I mean, there's horror stories. I'd say if you're feeling stressed, go for a walk. I know it sounds simple, but nature's a good time when you're feeling stressed or emotional about any of this. I find stepping away from the news, whether that's TV or online, wherever you consume that, it can be helpful.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And don't take your phone with you on that walk either. So
Indeed.
I, I think that's a good place to close out. Yeah. And like Elliot said, just to summarize, like hang in there. Don't let the, headlines today influence what you're trying to do next year, 5 years, 10 years from now. And we think you'll be okay if you just do that.
Great. Thanks, Matt.